Back in the heart of the harsh winter of 1871, the wind clawed across the high plains of Montana like a starving wolf. Snow lay heavy and unforgiving, burying the land under a white shroud that seemed to stifle sound and life alike. It was a place where survival was a daily, brutal negotiation, and death was a frequent, indifferent visitor. Caleb Jensen lay sprawled on the frozen earth, the cold seeping into his bones, a more insidious pain than the crimson blossoming beneath him. The skirmish had been sudden, brutal, a blur of shouting, gunfire, and the terrifying high-pitched cries of warriors he knew belonged to the Cheyenne. Though his scout company had been told the bands were further south, he had gone down hard, the impact stealing his breath, followed swiftly by the searing fire in his gut. Then the terrible quiet, the silence of the dead and the leaving. He had heard the distant thud of hooves fading, the wind picking up, already beginning its work of erasing the violence from the landscape. They had left him for dead. His own men, he suspected, hadn't even seen him fall in the chaotic retreat. The Cheyenne, if they had seen him stir, would have finished it. But the snow had begun in earnest, just as the firing ceased, a swirling white curtain falling fast. He remembered the sting of it on his face, mingling with the wet stickiness of his blood. He had closed his eyes against the sting, accepting the inevitable. He was broken, bleeding, alone, and freezing. This was how it ended. His life, which had known little softness since the war took his family and left him drifting, would simply bleed out into the indifferent snow. He had lived with loss like a phantom limb for years, a constant ache in his core. Now, isolation was absolute. He was less than a memory, a discarded piece of the fight already swallowed by the vast, white emptiness. Grief, like it had weight, pressed down on his chest, heavy as the snow. Not just for the life he was losing, but for the lives already lost that had shaped him into this solitary, hardened thing. His wife, taken by fever. His young son, a memory that could still splinter his heart like ice. He had come west seeking. What? Forgetfulness? A place as empty as he felt inside. He found only more emptiness, more cold. Resignation settled over him, quiet and profound. He was ready for the dark. He drifted in and out, the cold, a dull ache now, the pain in his belly receding into a vast numbness. Faces flickered behind his eyelids, his wife's smile, his son's bright eyes, the grim, set jaw of his captain. None stayed. The wind howled, like a thing grieving itself, a sound that seemed to echo the barrenness within him. He felt himself slipping, the edges of his consciousness fraying like old rope. Then, a presence, not the wind, a different stillness. He felt, rather than heard, the soft crunch of snow nearby. Fear, a cold, sharp spike, lanced through the numbness. Had they returned? A warrior? To take his scalp lock, perhaps? He tried to tense, to reach for the knife he knew was uselessly sheathed at his hip, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. He could only lie there, exposed and waiting. A shadow fell over him. He forced his eyes open, squinting against the swirling snow. The figure kneeling beside him was not a warrior, not a man at all. It was a woman, old. Her face was a roadmap of lines carved by sun and wind and time. Wrapped in thick hides, her movements were slow, deliberate. She didn't speak. Her dark eyes, sharp and clear despite her age, scanned him, taking in the blood, the ragged uniform, the stillness that bordered on death. There was no immediate malice in her gaze, but no obvious compassion either, just a deep, ancient assessment. She reached out a hand, hesitant, then rested it briefly on his blood-soaked coat near the wound. He flinched internally but remained outwardly still. Her touch was light, surprisingly warm. She murmured something in a language he didn't understand, the sounds soft, rhythmic, like water over stones. She looked towards where the skirmish had been, then back at him. A decision seemed to pass across her face, swift and final. Without fuss, she began to work. She pulled out a knife and panic flared, sharp and hot, but she used it to cut away the blood-soaked cloth around his wound, not on him. Her hands were gnarled, strong. She produced dried herbs, crushed them in her palm, mixing them with snow to make a paste which she then pressed firmly onto the wound. The cold of it made him gasp, but the herbs themselves brought a strange, earthy relief, a dulling of the pain. She worked with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice, of tending wounds under less desperate circumstances perhaps. Then came the monumental task of moving him. He was a dead weight, a large man burdened by injury and the cold. She seemed impossibly small, yet she had a strength that defied her frame. She somehow managed to drag him, inch by painstaking inch, across the snow. He lost consciousness again, the effort, the pain, the cold, too much for his depleted body. He woke to warmth, a soft enveloping heat that felt alien and utterly wonderful. He was inside. The air smelled of smoke, dried earth, and something else, herbal and sharp. He lay on soft furs. Looking up, he saw the conical structure of a teepee, the smoke hole open to the gray sky above, a small fire crackling merrily in the center, its flames dancing. The old woman was there, stirring something in an iron pot hung over the fire. She glanced at him as he stirred, her eyes steady. She offered no greeting, no explanation. She simply continued her task. The silence was profound, broken only by the snap of the fire and the whistle of the wind outside. It was a silence unlike the empty, despairing silence of the snow. This one felt watchful, expectant. Fear was still a cold knot in his gut, but it was tempered by confusion and the undeniable physical comfort. He was in a Cheyenne teepee. He, a United States soldier, a scout who had fought against these people. He was a potential enemy, perhaps the very man who had killed one of their own in the recent fight. Why was she helping him? Was this some form of slow torture, a waiting game? He tried to speak, his throat dry and raspy. Who? The word was a mere croak. The woman looked at him, her expression unreadable. She gestured towards his belly. Pain, a dull throb now, confirmed the reality. She then tapped her ear and shook her head gently. She did not understand him, or perhaps she simply did not speak his tongue. The latter seemed more likely. He was at her mercy, utterly dependent. She rose and came towards him, carrying a wooden bowl. The contents were steaming, giving off the same herbal scent. She knelt beside him, offering the bowl. He hesitated, suspicion warring with desperate thirst and hunger. Was it poisoned? A test? But the look in her eyes, while still unsmiling, held something that wasn't malevolent. Wariness, perhaps, or simply purpose. He swallowed, the simple act a labor. He took the bowl with trembling hands. The liquid was bitter, earthy, but warm and fortifying. He drank it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through his empty stomach. When he finished, she took the bowl, nodded once, and returned to the fire. The first days were a haze of pain, fever, and the constant quiet presence of the old woman. She tended his wound with a regularity that was almost ritualistic, changing the poultice of herbs, cleaning the area with snowmelt warmed by the fire. She fed him broth, thin and savory, and later, small pieces of dried meat he couldn't identify. Communication was non-existent beyond gestures, and the low, unintelligible murmurings she sometimes directed at him or the fire. He learned her routine, the times she stoked the fire, the way she left the teepee flap open a crack during the day for air, the rhythm of her movements. He watched her constantly, wary. He saw the lines of her face, the network of tiny wrinkles around her eyes that crinkled when she looked at the fire or stirred her pot. He saw the strength in her hands, the stoop of her shoulders from age or hardship, the quick darting glances she sometimes cast towards the teepee flap, as if listening for something. He was a prisoner, yes, but a cared-for one. The paradox gnawed at him. His mind, when the fever allowed, replayed the skirmish, the faces of his fallen comrades, the raw, unadulterated hate he felt for the warriors who had ambushed them. He looked at the woman, an enemy, and felt the conflict rage inside him. How could he accept help from one of them? It felt like a betrayal of the men he had lost, of everything he had fought for. Yet she was saving his life. She was warmth and sustenance and quiet care in a world that had proven cold and brutal. One afternoon, stronger now, the fever broken, he managed to point to himself and say, "Caleb." She paused, stirring the pot, and looked at him. She pointed to herself and said a word, soft and guttural. It sounded like Nahili. Nahili, he repeated, testing the strange syllables. She nodded, a hint of something that might have been approval in her eyes. It was the first real interaction, a tiny breach in the wall of silence and suspicion. Days blurred into weeks. the snow continued its relentless assault on the world outside. Inside the teepee, a fragile ecosystem developed. Caleb healed slowly. The wound closed, leaving a tight, angry scar. His strength returned, first enough to sit up, then to hobble around the small space. Nahili watched his progress with her usual quiet intensity. She never hovered, never spoke, but he felt her presence, a constant anchor in the quiet space. He began to notice the details of the teepee, small insights into her life, the worn beadwork on her moccasins, a small, beautifully carved wooden bird tucked among her belongings. The way she treated the fire, not just as a source of heat, but with a reverence that spoke of deep connection to the earth and its elements. He saw the lines of worry etched deeper when the wind howled, particularly fierce, or when the dwindling stores of dried meat became more apparent. She was living here alone, reliant on whatever provisions she had managed to gather before the heavy snows. The realization of her own vulnerability, helping a complete stranger, began to chip away at his ingrained prejudice. He tried to help. At first, simple things. Restacking the firewood, arranging the furs more neatly. Nahili would watch, sometimes with a faint nod, sometimes ignoring him. He learned to replenish the water in the small rawhide bags near the fire, fetching snow from just outside the flap. The cold outside was a sharp reminder of the sanctuary she had provided. One day, a particular strong gust of wind threatened to tear at the teepee lacing at the top. Nahili, despite her age, was already reaching for a pole to adjust it. Caleb, stronger and taller, instinctively moved past her, grabbing the pole and expertly maneuvering it to tighten the lacing. It was a simple task, but it required strength and quick movement. Nahili stopped, watching him. Her eyes, for the first time, held something more than quiet observation. There was a flicker of surprise, then something akin to gratitude. She murmured her soft, guttural words again, and this time they sounded like praise. "It's nothing," he mumbled, forgetting for a moment that she didn't understand English. But the gesture had been understood. A boundary had shifted. They fell into a routine of shared tasks, born of necessity. He would fetch snow for water, tend the fire, help rearrange the hides. She would prepare the meager meals, tend to his lingering aches with her poultices, share her knowledge of the subtle shifts in the wind. The meaning behind certain bird calls she seemed to hear even through the hide walls. They were two survivors, cast together by circumstance, finding a silent rhythm of mutual support in the face of the vast, indifferent winter. Mistrust didn't vanish entirely, but it receded, replaced by a hesitant, unspoken respect. He saw her resilience, her deep connection to the earth, a wisdom that went beyond books or military strategy. She saw, what? He didn't know. Perhaps just another living creature struggling against the elements, no different from the animals they relied on for food and furs. One evening, as the fire cast flickering shadows on the teepee walls, Nahili began to speak. It was not directed at him, but seemed to be a monologue, soft and melodic, punctuated by gestures towards the smoke hole, the fire, her heart. He didn't understand a single word, but he listened. The sounds were rich, filled with a history he could only guess at. He watched her face, the subtle shifts in her expression, the way her hands moved. He felt a strange sense of being let into a sacred space, a glimpse into a world utterly alien to him, yet one that had given him refuge. He imagined she was telling stories, perhaps of her ancestors, of the land, of the spirits of the wind and snow. It was ancient wisdom, flowing out into the quiet space between them. He started to share, too, in his own way, not with words, which were useless, but with small actions. Finding a particularly good piece of firewood, repairing a tear in the hide wall. One cold morning, he woke before her and quietly stoked the dying embers, adding wood until the fire blazed warm again. She woke, saw what he had done, and her eyes met his. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, the first he had seen. It transformed her face, chasing away the lines of hardship for a brief moment. "Thank you," he said, the word feeling inadequate. She didn't understand the word, but she understood the sentiment. She placed a hand over her heart and then gestured towards him. It felt like a profound exchange, a moment of pure connection that transcended language. The isolation that had been his constant companion for years began to feel less absolute. He was not alone. He was here, in this small, warm space, with this quiet, wise woman who had saved his life. The prejudice, the ingrained suspicion of the savage that had been drilled into him, felt shameful now. He had been ready to die rather than accept help from one of them. Yet she had shown him more compassion and care than many of his own kind ever had. Her simple act of humanity had cracked open the hardened shell he had built around his heart. He saw her not as an enemy, but as a person, a survivor, a giver of life. As winter began its slow, grudging retreat, marked by warmer days and the first sounds of melting snow trickling outside, their stores grew desperately low. Nahili had been rationing their food for weeks, and Caleb knew she was giving him the larger portions. His strength was fully returned now, his wound healed. He felt a growing urgency to contribute, to somehow repay her kindness. One morning, Nahili spent a long time by the fire, carefully preparing a small amount of dried meat and roots. She then wrapped it tightly in a piece of hide. She looked at Caleb, her eyes serious. She gestured outside the teepee, then pointed north, making a walking motion with her fingers. Understanding dawned, cold and sharp. She was sending him away. The food was for his journey. His chest tightened with a feeling he hadn't expected, a sense of loss, of abandonment. He had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, to their silent companionship. The world outside, even with the thawing snow, felt dangerous and empty again. He gestured to the meager food stores, then to her. He couldn't just leave her here with nothing. Nahili understood. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. She pointed to him, then made a wide gesture towards the horizon, implying his world, his people. Then she pointed to herself and gestured to the teepee, the land around them. This was her place. This was his. Their paths diverged here. A surge of fierce protectiveness washed over him. He couldn't leave her alone. Not now. The winter was ending, but other dangers lurked. Other soldiers perhaps, or worse, warriors who might not show the same mercy she had. He shook his head vehemently. He pointed to her, then to himself, then made a gesture of staying, of being together. Nahili's expression softened. She approached him and reached out, placing her hand on his chest, directly over his heart. She spoke softly, her voice low and resonant. While he didn't understand the words, the meaning was clear in her gaze, the gentle pressure of her hand. It spoke of fate, of different paths, of the transient nature of their shared time. It was gratitude and farewell, acceptance and release. Before he could protest further, a sound ripped through the quiet morning, the distinct thud of multiple hooves close by. Nahili's head snapped up, her eyes widening. She extinguished the fire with a swift, practiced movement, plunging the teepee into dimness. She motioned frantically for Caleb to hide behind some furs. Panic seized him. Who was it? His own men, or Cheyenne warriors? If it was his men, finding him in a teepee, they might shoot first and ask questions later, especially concerning Nahili. If it was warriors, his presence here put Nahili in terrible danger. He was the enemy. He crawled behind the furs, his heart pounding against the earth floor. Nahili remained still, listening. The sounds grew louder, closer. Horses whinnied, men shouted, in English, soldiers. Relief warred with a new kind of fear. How could he explain this? How could he protect Nahili from their potential prejudice and suspicion? The teepee flap was suddenly thrown open, letting in a blast of cold air and bright light. Two soldiers stood silhouetted against the snow, rifles raised. "Hold it right there," one shouted, scanning the interior. Nahili stood calmly by the dead fire pit, her hands clasped in front of her. She was a picture of quiet dignity, betraying none of the tension that must be coiled within her. "Just an old squaw," the second soldier muttered, lowering his rifle slightly, his gaze dismissive. "Wait," the first soldier said, his eyes narrowing. "Looks like someone's been living here. See the furs? And that pile of firewood?" He stepped inside, his boots crunching on the earth floor. The second soldier followed, his eyes sweeping over the small space. Caleb knew he had to act. He couldn't let them harm her, or assume the worst. He pushed aside the furs and stood, stiffly, his body still protesting the sudden movement. "Hold your fire," he said, his voice rough but clear. The soldiers spun, startled, their rifles snapped up, aimed directly at him. "Whoa, who the devil are you?" "Jensen," Caleb said, raising his empty hands slowly. "Scout Jensen, From Captain Miller's company. The soldiers exchanged a look of stunned disbelief. Jensen, we heard you were gone, lost in the skirmish. Almost, Caleb said, glancing at Nahili, who watched the exchange with an intensity that missed nothing. She found me, wounded, she saved my life. The soldiers looked from Caleb to Nahili, their faces a mix of confusion and deep-seated suspicion. The word squaw hung in the air, heavy with contempt. Their eyes lingered on Nahili, then on Caleb, putting the pieces together in a way that clearly disturbed them. A soldier found in a Cheyenne teepee, cared for by an old native woman. It didn't fit their narrative of enemy combatants. She saved you? The first soldier repeated, disbelief thick in his voice. A Cheyenne, after they jumped us? Yes, Caleb stated, his voice firm. He stepped slightly in front of Nahili, a subtle shield. She found me bleeding out in the snow. She brought me here, tended my wound, kept me alive through the winter. He saw the suspicion hardening their faces, the judgment in their eyes. This was the prejudice he knew so well, the us versus them mentality that fueled the conflict. Captain Miller needs to hear this, the second soldier said, his tone wary. This isn't right. What's not right? Caleb challenged, feeling a surge of unexpected anger on Nahili's behalf. That someone showed mercy? That an old woman alone risked her life to save a man she didn't know, one of the soldiers who fight her people? The soldiers shifted uneasily. His words, his presence, the stark reality of Nahili's quiet, non-threatening figure standing behind him, challenged their simple worldview of good and evil, friend and enemy. All right, Jensen, the first soldier said, his voice losing some of its bluster, replaced by an uncertain authority. Come on, let's get you back to camp. Captain needs to know you're alive. He eyed Nahili again. What about her? Caleb's gaze met Nahili's. There was understanding there, a shared knowledge that this moment was inevitable, the outside world intruding. He wanted to tell these men to leave her alone, to respect the life she had saved, but he knew such words would likely fall on deaf ears, or worse, incite aggression. She stays here, Caleb said. This is her home. She wants nothing from us. The soldiers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, unsure how to categorize it. A Cheyenne who helps a soldier? It defied their ingrained prejudices. All right, the first soldier finally conceded, though his expression remained suspicious. Let's move, Jensen. Winter's breaking, but it's still a long ride. Caleb turned to Nahili. He didn't know how to thank her, how to convey the depth of his gratitude, the profound shift she had caused within him. He took her hand, the same gnarled, strong hand that had cleaned his wound, offered him broth, and worked tirelessly to keep them both alive. Her skin was warm, dry. He squeezed it gently. Thank you, Nahili, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything, you showed me. He trailed off, the words insufficient. Nahili held his gaze. Her eyes, clear and ancient, seemed to look not just at him, but into him, acknowledging the change within him. She nodded slowly, a movement filled with grace and acceptance. She spoke her language one last time, a soft, flowing sentence. He didn't need the words. He felt the meaning resonate in the space between them, a blessing, a farewell, an acknowledgement of a brief, impossible bond forged in hardship. He released her hand reluctantly. He turned and followed the soldiers out of the teepee, back into the bright, cold light of the thawing plains. He looked back once before they rode away. Nahili stood framed in the entrance of her teepee, a solitary figure against the vast landscape, watching him go. She raised a hand in a gesture that might have been farewell, or perhaps simply an acknowledgement of the wind. The ride back to the military fort was long and arduous. Caleb answered questions tersely, offering only the essential truth. He was found wounded by an old Cheyenne woman who took him into her teepee and nursed him back to health. He omitted the details of their silent connection, the shared vulnerability, the quiet moments by the fire. He saw the skepticism in the soldier's eyes, the way Captain Miller listened with a tight jaw, clearly struggling to reconcile the story with his own experience of native peoples as hostile combatants. Life at the fort felt loud and jarring after the quiet solitude of the teepee. The camaraderie of the men felt forced, their casual prejudices grating on his newly sensitized nerves. He heard the crude jokes, the dehumanizing language used to describe the hostiles. It felt like a different world from the one he had inhabited for the past months. A world where an enemy had shown him unconditional kindness. The physical wound healed completely, but the internal one, the scar on his soul left by years of cynicism and loss, felt strangely soothed, replaced by a quiet sense of wonder and gratitude. He carried the memory of the warm teepee, the smell of smoke and herbs, and the silent strength of Nahili like a secret treasure. He thought of her alone on the prairie, wondered if she was safe, if she had enough to eat. Captain Miller called him into his office a week later. The captain was a stern, pragmatic man, focused on strategy and survival. "Jensen," he began, leaning back in his chair, "your story about the old woman, it's unusual." "It's the truth, sir," Caleb said, meeting his gaze steadily. "A Cheyenne," Miller mused, shaking his head slightly, "after what they did to Baker and O'Connell." "She wasn't part of the war party," Caleb said. "She lived alone." Miller was silent for a moment, tapping his fingers on the desk. "The men are unsettled by it. Doesn't fit what they know, what they believe." "Maybe what they believe isn't the whole story, sir," Caleb ventured, the words surprising even himself. The old Caleb, the one who had come west carrying grief and anger, would never have dared to question the prevailing view. Miller stared at him, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He saw a change in Jensen, a softening around the edges that hadn't been there before. This man who had been left for dead, who had returned from the wilderness with an improbable story of rescue by an enemy, was different. "Perhaps," Miller said finally, his voice low. "But out here, Jensen, belief is a powerful thing. It keeps men alive. It tells them who to trust and who to shoot." "It can also blind them, sir," Caleb replied quietly. Miller sat back, a long sigh escaping him. "All right, Jensen, you're back. You're a good scout. That's what matters. Keep your story to yourself, mostly. Doesn't do to confuse the men." Caleb understood. His experience didn't fit the simple narrative of good versus evil that the military, and indeed, much of the frontier, clung to. It introduced complexity, humanity, on the other side of the conflict. It was easier for them to see the Cheyenne as a faceless, hostile entity. Nahili was an inconvenient truth. He returned to his duties, but he was no longer the same man. The bitterness that had defined him for so long had been diluted by the unexpected wellspring of human connection. He saw the land differently now, not just as hostile territory or a resource to be exploited, but as a place with its own spirit, its own ancient rhythms, a place that Nahili belonged to in a way he, or any of the white settlers, never could. He scanned the horizon not just for signs of hostile parties, but for any sign of her teepee, her smoke. He never saw it. He didn't know if she had moved, or if she was simply hidden in the vast folds of the land she knew so intimately. He hoped she was safe. The quiet dignity of Nahili stayed with him. Her resilience in the face of isolation and hardship, her ancient wisdom that saw beyond the immediate conflict, her profound capacity for kindness, these things became anchors in his life. He thought of the stories she had told in her language he didn't understand, and he felt a sense of connection to something larger than himself, larger than the petty conflicts of men. He began to interact with the world around him, with a newfound quietness, an attentiveness he had learned from her. He watched the way the light changed on the mountains, listened to the subtle sounds of the prairie, paid attention to the signs the animals left. He was still a soldier, a scout, but he was also something more. He was a man who had been brought back from the brink by an enemy, a man whose worldview had been shattered and rebuilt by the simple, profound humanity of an old woman. He never forgot her hand on his chest, the feel of her touch, the look in her ancient eyes. It was a reminder that even in the most brutal landscapes, in the heart of conflict, kindness could bloom unexpectedly, a fragile, resilient flower pushing through the frozen earth. And that sometimes the most profound wisdom wasn't spoken, but lived, in the quiet strength and unwavering compassion of a single soul. His life, once defined by loss and isolation, now held the quiet echo of a connection that had saved him in more ways than one. He carried the memory of Nahili as a compass, guiding him towards a different way of being in the world, a way marked by resilience, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement that even in the most unlikely places, hope could be found, wrapped in the ancient wisdom of a kind heart.